But I now want to introduce our speaker today to keep us on time and give all the time for presentations and then for a Q&A session. So our speaker today is Marie Saldaña, and she occupies a position of academic technology specialist, which is a joint appointment between the history department at Stanford and the Stanford Library Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Research. And as you might just have heard, she joined Stanford in this position last September after taking a PhD in architecture at UCLA, and then also spending time in postdoctoral fellowships both at Rice University in Texas and the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And Marie's research focuses on urban studies and the formation of frontier communities. And we'll hear more about this today. And what makes it particularly compelling and characteristic is that given her background in architecture, she comes to talking about visual and spatial representations and documentations in a very new ways involving a variety of new methodologies. But her interest and her abilities span well beyond this. And I think this is something that we have already, many of us have realized in the few months that she has been with us, and we've already tremendously benefited from this wide range set of interests as well as an incredible generosity. So we are very fortunate to have her. And I also, while I can't wait to have for years to come more conversations with Marie for all of us, it's also a particular pleasure today to welcome her to present in our virtual CESTA seminars and hear more of her own most recent work. And with no further ado, I leave the floor to you, Marie, and to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna, for that very gracious introduction and invitation. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay. So yes, thank you to everyone at CESTA for the invitation to present this talk. I'm really excited to be speaking about this project because it's relatively new for me. And it's very different from what I focused on during my PhD and immediately after my PhD, which was 3D reconstructions of classical Mediterranean cities. So writing this talk has been an opportunity for me to reflect on and articulate my goals and reasons for this project. And it's been very helpful at this point in time, especially because lately I've been very narrowly focused on data collection and data cleaning. And I'm sure many of you know how that can be. So I also want to be upfront about my personal impetus for starting this work, which begins with my research into my family's origins, something that I started to pursue about 5 years ago. However, the family history in the title of my talk does not refer to my personal family history, my personal family tree, but to the common history and our interconnected nature of the people who inhabited South Texas and northern Mexico over hundreds of years. So about 2.5 years ago, I began collecting data related to the mid-18th century settlers in 5 cities along the Rio Grande, Reynosa, Camargo, Mier, Revilla, and Laredo. I did this because I kept coming across the same names across generations and locations, and I was trying to make sense of how they related to one another. The further I dug, the more astonished I was from my urban 21st century viewpoint that nearly everyone I studied was related and often in multiple ways. In my family's hometown of Corpus Christi, Texas, these same names that date from the 17th century crop up everywhere you turn. But somehow I had grown up with no awareness of this deep history of interconnectedness, and neither had my parents. Though this history was news to me, it is not, of course, a new discovery in and of itself. What I hope to contribute with this project, besides adding nuance to our understanding of a region, which is often eclipsed in American scholarship by the narrative of Texas independence from Mexico, is to make some of the rich body of sources that exist pertaining to the population of the Rio Grande Valley available for computational analysis and digital storytelling. Many Mexican Americans who live in Texas today, also known as Tejanos, are the descendants of the first Europeans to explore, settle, and write histories of the area. They are also the descendants of Native people who had lived in what is now Texas for thousands of years, as well as indigenous flex colonists who migrated from central Mexico as privileged subjects of the King of Spain. The early Tejanos established a ranching tradition that later became absorbed in the mythology of the American West and created a distinct culture, including music, food, and architecture. Yet their story, attenuated by generations under pressure to assimilate, has recently been further eclipsed by controversies around the international border, drug trafficking, and migration. The aim of my project is to provide a context for these contemporary issues by contributing to our understanding of the early history of the inhabitants of the Rio Grande Valley, focusing primarily on the 17th and 18th centuries, and to imagine ways to use digital technology to make their story available to a wider audience. So in this talk, I will first briefly sketch the early history of the northeast of Mexico, that is, and describe the conditions under which Texas was settled in the 18th century. Then I will describe the sources I'm using, the data I've been collecting, and outline the questions I'm asking for this project and why I believe these questions are important. Finally, I'll talk about my efforts at making the data computationally useful and describe some ideas for analyzing and presenting this data using digital tools. I'm particularly happy to be presenting this talk at CESTA right now because I'm still in the very early stages of this project, and I'd love to hear your feedback and ideas at the end. Northeastern Mexico, prior to the arrival of Europeans, was the home of Chichimeca Indians, a collective name for many nomadic tribes and bands. The Chichimecas fiercely resisted Spanish encroachment. The town of Saltillo was founded in 1577 on what was then the advanced northern frontier of New Spain. The 16 settlers, mostly European-born miners and soldiers, established the town in what will become a more or less permanent state of warfare with the Chichimecas. Soon after the founding of Saltillo, another colonizer, Luis Carvajal de la Cueva, was commissioned by the king to pacify and settle the northern frontier. Carvajal's grant was called El Nuevo Reino de León, and it was a huge area which included all of South Texas, as well as Coahuila, Tamaulipas, in the modern state of Nuevo León. Carvajal arrived to take possession of his territory in 1582, but his tenure was cut short when he was accused of being a Judaizer by the Inquisition and was imprisoned in Mexico City, where he died awaiting trial. Before his deposition, though, Carvajal succeeded in bringing dozens of families to Nuevo León, many of whom were from Portugal, and are considered by scholars today to have been of new Christian origin. That is, they were among the Sephardic Jews who were forced to convert or flee Spain in 1492. Many of these families had sought refuge in Portugal, and in 16th century New Spain, to call someone Portuguese was effectively to label them as Jewish. Whether or not this was true, we know that Carvajal, as well as the founder of Saltillo, Alberto del Canto, and many other settlers were of Portuguese origin. There is documentary evidence to suggest that a significant number of the early settlers of Nuevo León, which one scholar has estimated at as much as 65%, were of Sephardic descent. A population in the United States with close parallels with Tejanos are the Hispanos of northern New Mexico, where recent research has also found evidence of Sephardic ancestry. Also centered on the Rio Grande, but at its northern end, the events of the late 16th century shaped the history of both these populations. In 1590, after Carvajal's arrest, one of his men, Gaspar Castaño de Sosa, who was also Portuguese, led a group of settlers from Almaden in Nuevo León up the Pecos River in an abortive attempt to settle in New Mexico. His motives for doing so are unclear. It has been speculated that he was Jewish and was attempting to avoid a similar fate as Carvajal at the hands of the Inquisition. But another possible scenario is that Carvajal and his cohorts had from the start been most interested in rounding up and enslaving Indians, which was illegal in theory, although very common in practice. In any case, lacking the required royal permission to establish a colony, he was apprehended and imprisoned. The remainder of his colonists returned to Nuevo León, where a group of them were among the founders of the new city of Monterrey in 1596. A few years later, in 1598, Juan de Oñate led an officially sanctioned colonizing effort in New Mexico, which also ended in failure. Many of the settlers in Oñate's group eventually returned to settle permanently in Nuevo León. In addition to those looking to distance themselves from the Inquisition, Nuevo León attracted many settlers from the mining towns in Zacatecas and Durango. The first towns founded in Nuevo León, such as León and Almaden, were originally devoted to mining. Nuevo León turned out not to be particularly rich in mineral deposits, however, and by the mid-18th century, the economy had shifted towards agriculture, ranching in particular being well suited to the arid pasture lands around Monterrey and Saltillo. These two cities continued to be closely linked as families moved from one town to the other and intermarried. They were the administrative, ecclesiastical, and trading centers for the surrounding area, even as the population dispersed to various haciendas, ranchos, and the towns that grew out of those. So because I'm calling this a family history, it seems appropriate to mention the first family scandal in the Northeast. Inquisition documents recount a salacious episode between the founder of Saltillo, Alberto del Canto, and the founder of Monterrey, Diego de Montemayor. Apparently, Del Canto, who seems to have been a rather dashing character, was having an affair with Montemayor's much younger third wife. After numerous witnesses reported this to the Inquisition, Montemayor swore that he would not cut his hair or his beard until he had killed Del Canto, who had by this time gone into the mountains to hide amongst the Indians, with whom he seems to have been on very friendly terms since he hid amongst them on more than one occasion. Montemayor, unable to find Del Canto, had to settle for murdering his own wife instead. After all this drama had unfolded, the two men somehow managed to put their differences behind them, probably through the intervention of Carvajal. In any case, the affair ended with Del Canto marrying the daughter of Montemayor and the murdered third wife, and thus begins the family tree of thousands of people in Texas and northern Mexico today. Spaniards and Criollos were not the only colonists on the frontier. Several towns were founded and populated by Tlaxcaltec Indians from central Mexico. They had been granted special privileges by the king in return for their alliance with the Spanish against the Aztecs. They were permitted to establish their own autonomous colonies. They were exempt from taxes. They were given hidalgo status, which means that they could use the title don. They could ride horses. They could bear arms. In return, they were expected to serve as an example of quote-unquote civilization for the nomadic Chichimeca Indians native to the area, and to provide military support during pacification campaigns. A major Tlaxcalan settlement, San Esteban de Nueva Tlaxcala, was established next to Saltillo in 1591. And the residents of Saltillo were obliged to cede part of their lands and water to the Indian colonists. The mother colony gave rise to numerous smaller pueblos in Coahuila and Nuevo León during the following 2 centuries. Over time, most of the large estancias granted to the first settlers were broken up through sale and inheritance over the generations. By the mid-18th century, the population of the Northeast was looking to open a new frontier for settlement, where they could have their own lands, improve their social standing, and even upgrade their racial designation by claiming the privileges of first settlers. These migrations to the north of the mid-18th century included the first permanent settlements in what is now Texas, and were located in 2 distinct regions. Despite early missionary efforts in East Texas, by the mid-18th century, Spanish Texas was concentrated along the San Antonio River, from its headwaters at the Villa of San Fernando, which is today San Antonio, to the coastal settlement of La Bahia, or modern Goliad. Both of these settlements were anchored by a presidio and a mission, or multiple missions in the case of San Antonio. And these are the 2 institutions that came to be seen as a typical frontier complex. Settlers in these towns tended to consist of the families of soldiers and officers who were resident in presidios, many of whom were originally from the mother presidios in Coahuila, such as Monclova, Santa Rosa, and San Juan Bautista. Besides the soldiers and missionaries, San Antonio was the site of the king's only attempt to bring civilian settlers directly from Spain to settle on the northern frontier. In 1731, 16 families from the Canary Islands arrived in San Antonio after a journey lasting a full year. They were the first, and it turned out the only group of a proposed 400 settlers. They arrived with a sense of entitlement to the privileges that the king had bestowed in exchange for the hardship of migration. And although they were isolated in what was a veritable wilderness, they did not hesitate to use the law as means to claim what they saw as their rights. Los Isleños sent numerous petitions to the governor and to Mexico City, asserting themselves against an established military community made up of Mexican-born and largely mestizo soldiers. After a few generations, however, the 2 groups had intermarried, and thereafter jointly directed their complaints and lawsuits against the Franciscan missionaries, whose wealth and extensive land holdings they claimed were impeding their ability to raise livestock and support their families. The mid-18th century also saw a separate colonization movement along the Rio Grande. This area below the Nueces River was not part of Texas, but formed the northernmost region in a new colony called Nuevo Santander, today the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. Led by José de Escandón, towns were founded throughout the Gulf of Mexico region, from Tampico to the Rio Grande. Unlike in Texas, these settlements were primarily civilian, with the settlers mostly hailing from immediately surrounding areas, where they had lived for many generations. 5 towns were established along the Rio Grande, as mentioned earlier, and all except Laredo were established on the right bank of the river, and the river provided an additional barrier to the Apache and Comanche raiding parties from the north. These 5 Villas del Norte, as they're known, drew their population from surrounding areas of Nuevo León. In Mier, for example, many of the closely interrelated families came from Cerralvo, the original capital of Nuevo León, which was founded in 1582 and located only 39 miles away. Mier and the other river settlements were organized on a principle more closely resembling a civilian militia than a conventional Presidio mission complex, with citizens being required to equip themselves with arms and be ready to rise to the defense of their town. But like their neighbors to the north in Texas, their primary occupation was ranching. In 1767, long strips of land called porciones that fronted on the river were distributed to the settlers. These ranches were located on both sides of the river, meaning in Texas and in Mexico. In 1850 to 1852, the state of Texas certified and granted title to many of these lands belonging to Tejano owners. By this time, most of the Nueces strip had been divided into larger grants, and many of these were also granted title. However, after becoming Americans, many Tejanos would find it hard to hold on to their land in a society in which they found themselves treated as foreigners, or at best, second-class citizens. Though I'm focusing my work on the period prior to 1848, the people and their stories remain in the area to the present day. Tejanos have struggled to define their identity and to claim their place within American history, even as that history becomes buried under changing contemporary definitions of race, ethnicity, and nationality. Related to this are the diminishing availability and accessibility of Tejano material cultural heritage, especially architecture pertaining to civilian settlements. For example, homes, ranches, and other rural buildings from this period are increasingly rare, as opposed to the more monumental Presidio mission architecture that has tended to be preserved. The San Antonio missions are amongst the best examples of colonial architecture in Texas today, and they have been absorbed and protected by the National Park System. Similarly, at Goliad, Presidio La Bahia and its mission, Espiritu Santo, were the beneficiaries of the WPA program in the 1930s, and the reconstructed buildings are currently administered by Texas State Parks and the Catholic Diocese, respectively. Civilian architecture, however, remains largely invisible. A notable exception is San Ignacio, a town about 45 minutes south of Laredo, sited on the Rio Grande, and dates from the 19th century. It's built in an architectural style very common throughout the river towns. Houses were built of sandstone masonry, and they were almost like fortresses designed to withstand frequent Comanche raids. San Ignacio sits just upriver from Falcon Lake, a reservoir constructed in the 1950s that inundated many historic town and ranch buildings like those at San Ignacio. The creation of the reservoir also permanently erased an entire city, Revilla, one of the original Villas del Norte. The population of Revilla, by then renamed Guerrero, was relocated to a new city on higher ground, and residents were forced to abandon their homes and the church that they had occupied at the site for 200 years. To visit their ancestors on the Day of the Dead, families would get in boats and float over the site of the old churchyard. The material heritage of the region is also imperiled by a drug war that in the 2010s caused the whole-scale abandonment of drug towns, river towns like Mier. Feuding drug cartels took possession of entire cities, imposing their own martial law and leaving buildings riddled with bullet holes, which makes the study and preservation of buildings a very dangerous endeavor. On the north side of the river, that is in Texas, the historic ranch buildings that still exist are often located on private land, unpreserved and closed to the public. And like this 19th century chapel, are subject to requisition and demolition by the federal government for the purpose of constructing a border wall. Even at ostensibly public areas like Falcon Lake State Park, visitors are liable to be shadowed by law enforcement while enjoying picnic areas or trying to get a glimpse of the river. Just happened to yours truly. The drive through rural South Texas will be subject to multiple border control checkpoints where your vehicle may be searched. You'll be asked where you come from, where you're going, how long you plan to stay there, why you're going there. All of these conditions not very friendly to the exploration of cultural heritage. Because of this, I'm looking for ways to use digital technology to make Tejano history and cultural heritage more visible and accessible, to bring it into the narrative of our national history, but also to bring it to the lives of Tejanos themselves, many of whom, like myself, grew up with no knowledge of their deep roots in the region or their place in Texas history. So before I get into the digital humanities part of the talk, I want to acknowledge that this is a very early stage DH project. What I've done so far is to collect data from a variety of different sources which can tell us about the daily lives of the colonists. This data is not meant to be comprehensive. It represents the various directions that I was pursuing in my research at different times. And it could perhaps be called an artisanal data set. It has been a useful exercise, especially for me in my new role as ATS, because I suspect that many historians begin a digital project with similar kinds of material. At this stage, a technical and intellectual challenge that I have been grappling with is how to aggregate data from various types of documents. Extracting, compiling, and utilizing data from such a wide variety of sources is a very daunting task. Fortunately, I didn't realize that's what I was doing until I was already pretty far along. What I currently have is a Google spreadsheet with 35, actually it seems like 55, but it's only 35 tables or different sheets, which are meant to be tables in a relational database. The largest of these has approximately 7,500 records. So needless to say, the data is beginning to outgrow this spreadsheet, and I need to find ways to turn it into something more useful. So the most common kind of document I have been working with are ecclesiastical documents. Many of these have been digitized and indexed by the genealogy site Family Search, which is a very valuable resource. And not only are the index records searchable, but by far the most reliable and rich data comes from the perusal of images of the records themselves, which are also available online. So of birth, marriage, and death records, marriage records tend to be the most informative, as they often include the names of both the bride and the groom's parents, as well as their race and place of origin and residence. Marriage investigations. So anyone wishing to marry someone related by blood or marriage, which given the level of endogamy in northeastern Mexico was very, very common, had to submit a petition to the archdiocese, which in the 17th and 18th centuries was in Guadalajara. The petitioner had to present at least 3 witnesses who were able to attest that they knew the bride and the groom and could recount the family tree of each. First cousin or second degree marriages were very rare in this period at least, but marriage between 3rd and 4th degree relations was very common. The result of all these matrimonial investigations is a treasure trove of information. Even more so are the investigations resulting from cases where there is an illicit relationship involved, such as when the groom had abandoned the bride after promising to marry her, which was as good as being married, basically. Testimonials in cases like these could drag on for months and read like scandalous telenovelas. A third type of marriage investigation was required when someone born overseas wanted to marry in Mexico in order to make sure that he, and it was always the groom, was not already married somewhere else, for example. These records have been indexed for their genealogical information, but the index generally leaves out the details of the testimonies. So the original records, which have been digitized, fortunately, contain a wealth of stories waiting to be uncovered. Inquisition documents. As already mentioned, in the Del Canto Montemayor affair, these can be even more lurid than the marriage investigations. So the bureaucratic institution that was the Holy Inquisition documented the misdeeds of the faithful and the not so faithful, and these make very interesting documents. Church padrones, an interesting type of document, and in fact one of the very first that sparked my interest. These are censuses taken on a yearly basis by parish priests. These records are fairly rare, but they exist for several years in the late 18th century in Mier and Revilla. The fascinating thing about these padrones is that they allow you to reconstruct, through following the order in which the families were recorded, the spatial distribution of settlers. They begin with the families living in town, and then they proceed up and down both sides of the Rio Grande, recording the names and ages of the residents, the racial designation, the name of the ranch, the number of households living on each rancho, the number of dependents or servants in each household. So it's a very detailed snapshot of the river towns at this time. Municipal archives. Many Mexican, not many, but Mexican scholars have done tremendous work in compiling finding aids and summaries of the contents of city archives going back to the earliest days. Very notably those in Monterrey, compiled by Israel Cavazos Garza, and also the cities of archives of Saltillo, Cadereyta, and Camargo, amongst others, have been summarized, though they're not, the archives themselves aren't available digitally. The Bear archives pertaining to the province of Texas have also been partially digitized and indexed, and some are translated. So the types of documents available in civil archives include wills and testimonies. These give a detailed insight into the origins and family connections of an individual, as well as their economic status, land, livestock, household possessions, down to the most mundane objects. They also give a sense of the complex web of debts that connected people in a society where cash was very scarce. Legal documents such as lawsuits and land transactions. These are a very tantalizing glimpse into the economic and social realities of the time. And early histories. So in Nuevo Leon, we are very fortunate to have two historical accounts of the early days of Nuevo Leon, as well as the first expeditions into Texas. These contain valuable insights also into the names, habits, and languages of Indian tribes that have otherwise vanished from the historical record. The two 17th century authors, Alonso de Leon and Juan Bautista Chapa, were functionaries attached to the governor, who also settled in the Northeast and had many descendants. So they are amongst the Tejano population themselves. De Leon and Chapa's histories describe some of the earliest entradas into Texas, and these early expeditions also left behind numerous travel diaries and accounts of the geography, flora, and fauna of Texas in the 17th century. So, as is often the case with projects like this one, the kinds of questions I imagine being able to ask of the data have evolved as I continue to interrogate the sources. A few of these questions can be put in general terms, untangling social and familial relationships. What I'm interested in this respect is uncovering the motivations for personal decisions, and these personal decisions, when they're aggregated over time, result in social trends and movements on a larger scale. So what role did the desire to protect vested interests, such as land and social status, play in any given decision? And what were the most valued priorities? These questions are at the root of my reasons for undertaking this project. Also, how can we understand the ways in which the settlers on the San Antonio River and those on the Rio Grande viewed themselves and each other? Did they regard themselves as distinct groups despite common roots? How did differences play out over time in the development of Tejano identity? For example, to what extent did military presence in Texas provide a link to Europe in the form of Spanish career officers who married into local families? And did the links between Spanish-born officers and their families that persisted through generations distinguish society in Texas as opposed to the Rio Grande region? How and when did racial mixing occur? What were the tribal identities of women who bore the illegitimate children of Spaniards? This is a very complicated question, but what's certain is that the less Spanish a person's claimed ethnic identity, the less information that exists about them in the historical record. So this makes it very difficult to trace the lives of Indians or people of mixed descent. To what extent did the Tlaxcaltec Indians, who were concerned in many ways as much as the Spanish with their purity of blood as a way of maintaining their privileges, intermarry with other ethnic groups? A further interesting question is changing racial identity. It has often been said that in the North, racial categories were more vague and fluid than in other parts of New Spain. So the kind of data that I'm collecting might help us to evaluate the extent to which this was true and whether it changed over time. Census records and other documents make it clear that many ranchos and haciendas were more like small villages than individual family residences. Aggregating data related to social relationships and land tenure may illuminate patterns in the ways in which people inhabited and worked the land, and the way such patterns may have changed. In Spanish custom, women always kept their maiden name, which makes it fortunate for me to trace them, but also they were allowed to inherit and own property. Children were given two surnames, the paternal and the maternal, and sometimes the maternal became the primary one that they used. So it would be very interesting to ask, from the many examples of women, especially widows, who held their own as wealthy landowners and ranchers, how did they, to look to the data for insights into how they managed their social position. And finally, this project is admittedly not yet an architectural project, unfortunately, but I do hope that by investigating foregoing questions, I'll be able to bring these insights to bear on the built environment and gain a better understanding of the people who live there. So this is open for now, but I do see there's a lot of potential in this area. It's just my specialization anyway. Okay, so for an example of the kind of insights this data might provide, I want to mention the case of Martin de Leon. He was an impresario like Stephen F. Austin, one of those who made contracts with the newly independent government of Mexico to bring families to create towns and settle in Texas. His colony, Victoria, was founded in 1824 and is today a city of more than 100,000 people. Several biographies have been written about him, most of which repeat assertions that he was from an aristocratic, wealthy family from Spain who hobnobbed with European rulers, though other more recent research has correctly surmised that he came from a more local and modest background. So my investigation into the sources that I've outlined above indicates that De Leon's family originated in Montemorelos, Nuevo Leon, a town that grew out of the estate of Alonso de Leon, the 17th century author and historian. It is very likely that Martin de Leon was related to this family, as it appears he was also a descendant of both Alberto del Canto and Diego de Montemayor, the founders of Saltillo and Monterrey. Martin de Leon's parents, along with a group of their close relatives, were amongst the first settlers in Nuevo Santander in the 1750s, and they established the towns of Burgos and Curillas. In his youth, Martin de Leon was an enterprising military captain who began establishing ranches along the Comanche-terrorized Nueces in about 1800. All of this indicates that though their material circumstances were what might be called middle class, Martin de Leon and his family came from a long line of Mexicans who had gradually pushed the frontier northward through various risky endeavors, all the while remaining very deeply connected to the land and the people that they came from. I believe it is important to recognize this aspect of Texas heritage, which belongs not to so-called aristocrats from Spain or to even newcomers from the United States, like Austin, but to those families who had quietly populated the Northeast for many generations. So some of the possible digital forms that I imagine this project taking are, as I mentioned before, the relational database. This is a logical next step, which would allow me to share the data that I've been collecting. And a big shout out to my colleague insider, Simon Wiles, for helping me to conceptualize this. Not only would I be able to help someone out who's in the stage I was at a few years ago trying to trace my family roots, but one of the concerns that I would have in building this database is how to represent uncertainty or conjecture. Genealogy is notoriously rife with lists of names that often reproduce other lists of names and leave out small words like perhaps or could be that qualify statements. And so they present conjecture as fact. Another issue I'm currently dealing with is that having neglected to think of my list of names or spreadsheet as a database, a relational database, meant that I did not assign unique IDs to all of these records and individuals that I was listing, which means I have to go through and do it manually because of all of the names that are similar. There's no way I could do this automatically. So this task is likely to continue for many months, especially as I can't resist adding new content all the time. So network visualization, these are the first types of analysis that I attempted with this data. At first, I did start to draw networks by hand, thinking that it would be a simple endeavor, but these drawings became increasingly complex as to be almost unfeasible. So once I have completed the relational database, in theory, I should be able to produce as many network visualizations as I want instantly, but my initial attempts at this, though, indicated is not quite that straightforward. I will probably need to find a hybrid approach that combines computational network generation and with the word artisanal design elements. in order to make sense of the various kinds of relationships hidden in this data. So here's some of the examples of the hand drawings I did before the network got too out of hand. I started out relatively modestly, but as the web of connections grew, it became harder to manage the overlapping links and to make them visually clear and informative. So I tried various techniques of spatial arrangement and color, but ultimately it seemed like it was an insoluble puzzle. But I like puzzles. So I ended up with a network of about 750 nodes that when I drew it by hand, looked like this. And then when I eventually computationally visualized this same network in Gephi, I got something that looks like this. So I'm not quite sure this is more useful. It does look more like a tangled up ball of yarn, but obviously I have a long way to go in the finer points of network visualization. But I think it's a goal worth pursuing, even if it costs me months of entering unique IDs individually. Because I'm not working with a data set that can be considered more or less complete, even big enough to warrant computational modeling, I'm not sure that I anticipate being able to do much in the way of computational analysis in the quantitative sense for this. But it might be possible in very limited instances, such as this is a preliminary visualization I've made with the marriage investigation data that shows the origins of men who married local women in northeastern New Spain between 1691 and 1754. The majority hail from the northern provinces, especially the Basque Country, and Cantabria, which was then part of a large area called Las Montañas de Burgos. Of course, the marriage investigations themselves are incomplete and they are a biased representation of reality. But this starts to give a picture of the global forces at work that brought people to northeastern Mexico in the 18th century. Previous work by Leslie Offutt on Saltillo has shown that men who immigrated from Spain during this period tended to be overrepresented in the merchant class, and they also tended to follow other family members who had arrived previously. So the concentration of origins in certain areas shown by this map would seem to support her conclusion. Maps and digital storytelling. So I have found it impossible to give this talk without showing a series of many maps. So if computational analysis is of limited usefulness at this stage, one digital outcome that might be a good match for this data could be a story map. And in a previous stage of this research, I had also begun georeferencing 18th century maps and compiling a GIS geodatabase of various travel accounts of entradas into Texas, so that I could figure into the spatial aspect of the project somehow. I would also like to locate and document the various ranch buildings that were surveyed in the 50s prior to the construction of the Falcon Dam. Ideally, all the spatial aspects of the project would be integrated with the relational database, but this will probably happen much, much further down the road. And public history. So this is another potential direction for the project, and it would be to solicit and incorporate input from the community, such as photos, stories, and other pieces of information to fill in this story. I think this would be the ultimate goal of any digital project I make with this data, because the story ultimately belongs to the community. So to conclude, my aim in this talk has been to provide a brief sketch of the history of the Tejano people and to highlight their deep connection with northeastern Mexico, to give an overview of the wealth of sources available to scholars for this period and this area, and to make a case for why this history is a vital part of our understanding of the Southwest as Americans. I also hope to start the process of thinking about ways in which digital technologies might help these stories come alive and be preserved. And to that end, I welcome your questions, comments, and ideas. Please feel free to reach out to me, not just about this project, but also in my capacity as ATS, because I'm here at Stanford to foster all kinds of digital history projects. And thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Marie has very kindly agreed to take questions. We'll use the same procedure that we've used in past weeks, where I'll moderate the question and answer period. If you'd like to let us know that you are interested in asking a question, please hover your mouse over the bottommost margin of your screen. A little bar should pop up in which there is the participants icon. Click that icon, and then in the list that pops up, there'll be an icon, a little blue icon that says raise hand, and you can use that to let us know you're interested. And so with that procedural note, we'll open up the floor for questions. All right, I see Laura has a question. I'm unmuting you now, Laura. Go ahead.
Okay, great, thanks. Hi, Maria. That was really interesting, and actually, I really enjoyed both the digital history side and the hardcore old school history side. I have questions that fall into two categories, and I'll just kind of put them out there for you to field as is useful. So the first half of these questions are about Nuevo Leon as a frontier space that is possibly being utilized by Sephardim in seeking a space where they're being less intensely persecuted. It might be by the Inquisition. And so I had some questions about that. I know that there has been some really intense interest in Mexico in new genealogies, and that has confirmed Nuevo Leon as a kind of site of former settlement by Sephardim. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and also entangling with that, I was curious about your inquisitorial documents. And knowing that at least some of the people who show up before the Inquisition are accused of Judaizing, and those people might in fact be Sephardim or might not be. I had a set of questions about what made particular people get accused as opposed to others, and what did people do to hide themselves, if you know about that. So there's that whole set of questions. And then if I might sort of throw in a different set of questions about a different group that might be using this space, the frontier space in a particular way, right? And that would be the Tlaxcala, who you say have this Hidalgo status, and they're sort of establishing themselves or maintaining a status of dons, of having a special relationship to the Spanish Empire that I assume dates all the way back to Cortez and their alignment with him in that crucial moment, right? So what I was curious about with the Tlaxcala was the degree to which they might be creatively using this frontier space, in fact, to build or support that identity, or to expand their own sort of personal power outside of the more immediate intensity of sort of the colonial space close to Mexico City. Mm-hmm. So I had a set of questions about the Hidalgo there as well. And I'd love to hear whatever you have to say on either or both of those topics. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Those are both really, really great, fascinating questions. And I can only say what I've really observed in the sources I've been looking at so far, which mostly are within the, say, second half of the 17th and first half of the 18th century. So with regard to the Sephardic influence, I mean, there has been a lot of this fascinating research that does seem to confirm that they were there. I have not observed anything in the sources that I've seen that indicates that the people living there in the early and mid 18th century had any other view of themselves other than as Catholics. And I know that there's been a lot of research in New Mexico about contemporary practices that might indicate a sort of hidden Jewish identity. Similarly in Texas. And one interesting thing about the way this is kind of entered into the modern world is that Spain has currently, or they have in the past few years, opened up a process for people to apply for citizenship based upon their relation to these early Sephardic immigrants to Mexico. So if you can prove that connection and you can speak Spanish, you can in theory become a Spanish citizen, which was an interesting thing that a lot of people have been in the process of doing. So it really does impact these 21st century lives in real ways, whether your ancestors left in 1492 or in the following centuries. So yeah, I really have seen very, very little personally, and I'm still, the very beginning stages of this, but that has indicated that people were aware that they came from Sephardic ancestry, that has any kind of overt connection to the way the documents read, though the documents themselves are mostly Catholic Church documents, so it wouldn't be likely that they would reflect any of this. So I think that as I get further into looking at the different kinds of sources out there, these, if there is anything that can be read under the surface or is indicated maybe more by material culture rather than text documents that exist. In a lot of cases, the sorts of stories and things that come up in New Mexico, for example, have to do with material culture. They have to do with the Star of David being on gravestones and things like that, or to practices and oral traditions and not necessarily things that are written. So I think that looking at those kinds of heritage in addition to the documents might provide a light on that. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there. With regard to the Tlaxcalan colonists, Leslie Offutt, she's written about them in the context of Saltillo and done some work on their perception of their purity of lineage. And it does seem that they tried to preserve this to the utmost that they could, because they did realize that they had a pretty good deal. They had even a better deal than many colonists on the northern frontier, because they had sort of locked in like their early adopter rate. They had got all these privileges when they were for the taking, and then most colonists later on didn't get these. So they wanted to make sure that they were seen as pureblood Tlaxcalan colonists with no interfering lineages from other Indian tribes or even Spaniards. I mean, they just wanted to make sure that they had this like locked in. So I do think that it was the case, at least early on. And interestingly, I have not found in the documents that I've been looking at, which is for Nuevo León in general, that there was a lot of intermarriage between Tlaxcalan Indians with Spaniards or castas or other people of other ethnic groups. They do exist, but they don't seem to be very prevalent. So it's interesting to think, because some scholars have said, well, Tlaxcalans, they were living there, so they must be part of our, just the general makeup, genetic makeup. But it's interesting to ask, how and when did this occur, if it did occur? So that's another interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah, what you say about the Tlaxcalan idea of purity fits very well with, I think, was it Cope who writes about Mexico City and the emergence of racial identity and sort of the intensity of focus that Spanish imperial questions placed on sort of local tracking of identity and degrees of mixture and so forth. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciated your talk.
Sure.
More questions for Marie? If not, I have one. So I know when we were talking about finalizing your title for your presentation, you said the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as your sort of endpoint in the middle of the 19th century. I'm curious how you're thinking in terms of historical narratives and in terms of change over time, how you see sort of phases happening within this, or impressionistically, whether you're noting that there are trends and patterns that change over time. Impressionistically, my family immigrated to Mexico in the later part of the 19th century from the Middle East. And a lot of these stories have a certain sort of resonance where they're not so unfamiliar to me. So I'm curious how you're thinking about the sort of longer series of trajectories.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, deep down, I kind of suspect that part of my resistance to going past 1848 is that I won't like what I find, especially because it gets too close to home at that point. And I know this is something probably have to overcome, but I found it easier to focus on the earlier times when these people were sort of they were more empowered. And I know this can be a pitfall, especially when you're dealing with genealogically related work. And I've seen in a lot of the secondary sources that I've read, people are either very interested in claiming a certain kind of identity from this. Being someone who kind of did a lot, was trained in, classical ancient past, I don't have a lot of theoretical resources to draw on yet. So I'm kind of still grappling with how to make this, work for me as a scholar and as a person. So, so that could count for why I focus on the 17th and 18th centuries. But I do, I think that as far as phases go, what I see is that, like in the beginning, this area is starting to be settled. It was a very, 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 very sparse density of people. There were only a few families there. They all knew each other. They were all interconnected. They all pretty much, I'm sure there was like, they started off with like 16 families in one town, and that very slowly grew just from that core group. So over time, I think the early history was really like the Wild West, and where people, it was like you and your gang of buddies pretty much getting away with whatever you could get away with. And after that, it was really you and your extended family. and whatever that entails. So so I guess like the big transition for me, the break comes when Texas becomes part of the United States, and then a lot of complicated things happen, which I don't know how I'm going to be ready to deal with that. Luckily, a lot of other scholars have been dealing with that much more than the earlier period, at least in American scholarship. So, but I think that why I started with the mid 18th century was that it was this sort of like crystallization of this process. Like they had gone through successive waves of colonization and settlement. And by this point, when Escandón is colonizing Nuevo Santander, these families had already settled in new locations very, very gradually over a couple of hundred years. So it's a very crystallized moment where the settlement process happens. And in a way, this kind of helps in one way because all the sort of documentation around it is very, very well organized and very available. But it also kind of, it shows how their sort of collective identity had been built up around the process of being settlers on the frontier. And maybe to maintain that identity, they had to keep settling the frontier. So moving 40 miles further out. And then, so that's kind of how I see it at this point. It's a very interesting question.
Thanks very much. I believe Giovanna also has a question.
Yes, Maria, this was such a wonderful talk, and I loved how the juxtapositions of very different type of visual material, as much as you say that all the visualizations that you plan on and hope for are still to come. And but it was so interesting to see mixing the historical map, the Google map of today, and photographs, and and in a way, my question starts with this. You can also start from this last image of the Rio Grande as an international border, because that's a river that then becomes a border. And so that we recognize immediately, and it's such an easy feature of the landscape that functions as a border at some point. But instead, I wondered then if one were just to not have any of this and just your database, which is again not yet complete but in progress, where would you find a border or frontier emerge from the data themselves, if at all? And I don't know if it's a question that you can yet answer, but I would just be curious, where are there ways to look at the data, or does the data speak and brings to the fore concepts, and maybe there is more than one, of frontier and border in itself?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I think it calls out sort of my my training and my bias towards visual media, and I think that kind of precedes with the work that I'm doing. And actually, the database is a very new genre for me, and I didn't do a lot of sort of quantitative data or database work before, and really I've sort of started from a place of not even realizing that I was doing a database. So I'm still like, I'm really glad that you asked this, because this is sort of one of the things that I hope to gain from this presentation at CESTA, was to think about how could I think about this data? What are some other ways, alternative ways to think about it that might not occur to me because I'm automatically wanting to go and do visualizations or maps or things like that. And I managed to resist so far 3D modeling, so that's the first step, but it might come back into play. But yeah, I don't think I can really answer that right now, but I think it's definitely something that you've suggested that I will keep in mind as I continue, because it's a really interesting idea, and I do want to sort of push the boundaries, as it were. So.
Thank you.
Well, and to follow up on this, the valley, the Rio Grande Valley spans both sides of the border, and that space sometimes functions as a unit, even though there is this national boundary that divides it. So that is another sort of artifact where 3D modeling or sort of 3D sort of spatial things may not help you, but it might be worth thinking about what that space is for at least that part of this. Any more questions for me? Oh, I see Laura's hand is back. All right, I'm unmuting you now, Laura. Whoop. go ahead.
Great, thanks. So since we've turned to the digital humanities side, I actually am also kind of putting data into sheets that will later become a relational database. So I was taking careful notes when you started mentioning pitfalls. And I wondered if you had any other thoughts on that particular process, the process of putting a bunch of data into sheets that eventually will make its way into a relational database. I know you're not through that process yet, but facing some of those pitfalls. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I actually love my spreadsheet, and I use it all the time, and I think it'll be hard to kind of give it up and move to something else, but it is, because it is, you know, not designed for like, you know, persistent acquiring of thousands of records, and just I've kind of made it work for me, but I realize I'm, you know, it's not meant for that. But I do think that there is a place for these kinds of lists. And I mean, I really made it because I was just taking notes. I was just trying to collect information and put it into rows and columns and see how it fit together. But my big mistake was not sort of being aware that I would eventually get to the stage where I need to make it a relational database, and therefore have to go back and spend months and months and months cleaning it and making it useful like that. So it is really like, it's this sort of task that tests your commitment to something, because you'll sit there for hours day after day and be like, what am I doing? This is a project I should do when I'm, you know, well past retirement maybe. but yeah, so I mean, in the case where, I mean, I think this is my oversight, you know, I kind of didn't start with the intention to do this kind of a project. So I didn't set it up that way, but yeah, as long as you're aware of it from the beginning and you're being careful to kind of keep your data in the format which will translate easily into a relational database, you should be good. I mean, there's no problem.
Thanks.
All right, last call for questions for Marie. All right, let us all thank Marie for a wonderful presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Have a good afternoon. Next week, as I said, the Literary Lab will also be presenting, so more information will be forthcoming by email about that. So stay tuned, and we'll hope to see you next week.